Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the library for hosting and for letting me be a part of the Uplift Asian series. I was looking at the programming and just such an incredible lineup. I also love coming to Vancouver because my dear friends are just like the most gracious, wonderful hosts, and I love going to the Stanley Park Aquarium and drawing weird fish all day. So I'm just really thrilled to be here. And I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from Feeding Ghosts. You might remember that my grandma's mental state was measured by one simple rubric. Was she writing? When she was in relatively stable periods, she was content to sit all day at her writing desk, emerging only to use the bathroom and eat the lunch my mom left out for her. Nothing could disrupt her focus. She endlessly scrawled out the same stories of her past, even as they made progressively less sense. Towards the end, she even started writing her characters sideways or backwards. But Sun Yi remained vain and proud, and her brief exposure to fame had left her with a need to believe that her words were still being read. She needed an audience to witness the world she spun. My mother created a strategy to accommodate this. It is a perfect illustration of why we were at war. When I was in my late teens, I came home one day to find my grandmother agitated and yelling at my dad while waving a piece of paper. They steal money. Very bad, very bad. That piece of paper was a fake publishing contract. My mom needed Sun Yi to believe that people were still reading her words. So she had created an imaginary publisher in New York. Fake letters were sent to Sun Yi through the real mail, with fake book contracts accompanied by fake checks, all to create the illusion that someone was reading Sun Yi's incoherent words and turning them into books. She went so far as to have them printed and bound so Sun Yi could receive published copies of her works. That day with the fake contract, look, Sun Yi, you have been paid. No one is cheating you. You are okay. Here, Tessa will come help you. I took the paper in my hand and repeated the family lie. See, Sun Yi, it says right here, no one took your money. You are safe. But inside me, everything was screaming, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. My mom and I argued about it. You're taking someone with a mental illness that makes her paranoid, that people are lying to her and shaping her reality. And you're lying to her and shaping her reality. It's a deception born from great love. I didn't disagree. I also didn't think that love made it right. But I was the only one who held no right to criticize. I was the one who had chosen to leave home, to ignore my duty. So which is the true story? Did the selfish American turn her back on her family? Or did the principled lone wolf take the only moral stand she could? The only distinction between a cradle and a cage is whether or not the occupant is attempting to break free. Over a decade later, I was listening to an old episode of This American Life and heard something that began to reframe the way I saw this story. Act 1, What You Don't Know. Lulu Wang has this case study of people not admitting the truth. When my grandmother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, she was given 3 months to live. She was 80 years old. A Chinese grandmother is diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the family decides to protect her by keeping this knowledge from her. But they need the extended family to gather to say their goodbyes. So they rush the timeline on a family wedding as a cover story, and the entire clan assembles in China to say their farewells to the only person in the family who does not know that she is dying. This is framed as an enormous act of love. The Americanized granddaughter is the only one who feels torn apart by the choice to lie. As the story unfolded, I felt my chest constrict in recognition. This was my family. And seen through this lens, my mother wasn't crazy. My mother was Chinese. Where I saw deception, manipulation, and overreach, she saw love, devotion, and duty. How can one bridge a gulf so vast? I'm American. I'm Chinese. Looking back, the fake books were just another chapter in the fight my mom and I have been having for my entire life. So many of my conversations with my mother end at the impasse of our irreconcilable worlds. I know all families have trauma, but what I always felt, I guess I'm wondering, do you think it's normal to just stay within it in the way that our family did? I think you're American. I think you know nothing of trauma and have no idea what people in other parts of the world experience. It shows how naive you are that you'd even ask that question. She was right that it was my American audacity that allowed me to envision a present that might not be dominated by the past. But I was right that my family's past was a broken bone that had never been set. And it meant we could never fully heal. Sometimes I thought of my grandmother's writing as a time machine. I imagined her desk as an H.G. Wells contraption and watched her endlessly scribble out the story of the past from which she had never escaped. For my mom, this represented a triumph of safety, keeping my grandmother in a bubble that provided a quality of life more stable than anything they'd known in China and Hong Kong. But for me, with the grandeur of my American dreams, this was a painfully perfect illustration of how our family lived trapped in our wounds, where no new life could ever grow. The present was the past. The future was the past. We could never write a new story. The light could not get in. This sense of being bound with an unchanging story lay at the core of the conflict between my mom and me. When we talk about this now, we cannot reach a shared narrative, but we agree that by the time I reached my teenage years, I was in a dark and desperate place. In my mother's version of events, she'd seen me drowning as a child and stepped in to save me. While I believe that her attempts at rescue were what pushed my head beneath the waves. We will never agree on the sequence of events, but where they left us was irrefutable. We were adrift in the ocean, struggling to stay afloat. My mother came to save me from drowning, but she couldn't see that the screams that drew her were coming from her throat, never mine. When I yelled at her to let me go so I could swim to shore, that rejection must have cut to the bone. She did not hear the urgency beneath it. Those years were a storm of confusion, fear, and anger. I wasn't ready to carry my family's story without drowning, so I performed the ultimate betrayal. I chose to be American rather than Chinese. I cut my family loose and swam for the light, turning my back on everyone because I knew no other way to survive. You are not my family. These are not my ghosts. This was brutally effective. The only way I could speak was through my absence. So I left. Later, when I asked my mom what that time had felt like for her, she told me. Those were the years of my terror. I'd already lost my mother to mental illness, and I thought I was losing my daughter too. And that's where I'll end.
Hey, there's a power button on it. Thank you, Tessa. That was lovely. I want you to know, I told Tessa this story when we were back in the green room, but when Jorge emailed me and said, would you like to host this event? I said, well, funny you should ask. I am actually reading this book right now. It's on my coffee table. I love it. I loved it. I read it over 3 nights. I fell asleep with it on my chest. It's actually quite heavy, so I have strong lungs. It's fine.
I mean, I've said that if you ever need a weapon in a dark alleyway, it's like a dual-purpose object.
Ooh, it could work. And it's got a good title for like fighting off, bad things. But it's so, so good. And I hope everyone, if they haven't already read it, reads it. It is such an achievement. And one of the things that I was like so amazed by is that it works. It actually works holistically with so many different components to it, visually, textually, psychologically. There's the whole memoir aspect of it, and all of that. And there's so many things at play here. And when I read other people's books, I often think, oh, I can see how they started. Like maybe they start with a line, or they start with an image, or they start with a premise. But I couldn't figure that out for your book because there's so many different ways that it works on so many different levels. So my question is, what was the sort of inciting thing that made you want to write this book? Was it an image, or was it just like everything? Did it just plop into your head as this huge thing?
I mean, I think it was more just an eventual admission of defeat, where I ran as far as I could for as long as I could, and there wasn't anywhere else I could go. I went to Antarctica and was like, well, shit, I still have a complicated mother.
Like, you literally went as far as you could.
I did. Yeah, I got to the end of the earth and was like, well, only way out is through. And then it's actually the inciting incident is in the book, where I had kind of set up this life where I was able to have a really pathological amount of individual freedom. And I would use that to go on many 1,000-mile bicycle rides and just kind of have a good think. And I was biking alone up a mountain, sort of realizing a couple months after my 30th birthday that I was entering a new chapter, and I couldn't just keep being an American cowboy, and there was a task I had to face. And so I asked rhetorically, because you talk to yourself a lot when you bike a couple 1,000 miles, and I said, okay, well, if this chapter is over, what comes next? And I had this like Paul on the road to Damascus moment where my ghosts, and like Asian ghosts are very meddling. They're like not subtle.
No.
And so they just told me, someone has to feed the ghosts. Yeah. And I knew what it meant, and then 9 years of my life disappeared.
It's like, I find this really interesting though, like the whole like topic of like Asian ghosts. They are very meddling. They don't let go. Part of the reason I wrote my first novel is that my grandfather told me to. He'd been dead for like 20 years by that point. And the thing about ghosts, and this is like an actual question, like the illustrations or the artwork in here is very like Asian ghosty, like Hong Kong sort of movies from like the 20th century, those hairy little ghosts that hover on rooftops and like crouch and stuff. So how is that like, did you take inspiration from those sorts of ghostly things? Because I see it in your art, but it's not like a direct reference visually necessarily, but a lot of it feels very familiar to me.
I mean, I think that's just always how I saw the world. It wasn't needing to seek out visual information, because I basically think the job of an artist is to be almost painfully sensitive to the world, where like your filter is just bad and so more gets in, and so you're like kind of always osmotically channeling everything around you. And I think because I grew up within this like very literal trauma loop of my grandmother sitting at her desk rewriting the same story of her past, like she had a lot of ghosts, and I just saw them. And so it wasn't like the aesthetic was a deliberate choice. It was just, well, that's what my house looked like. So I drew it that way.
So like it was really interesting. You have a couple of like actual photographs of people in your family that you then turn into these characters, these visual characters. What was that process like when you're looking at, you know, your grandmother and your mother, photos of them, and then sort of recreating them? I asked you a little bit about this backstage too, because you also draw yourself, which must be a real funhouse mirror of like situation. So like, what was that like for you, especially drawing people that you know really well, which is totally different ball of wax from somebody else?
Well, I think one of the hardest things for me about learning how to make this book was that I didn't draw comics. It wasn't a medium that I had worked in, and so I was pretty literally having to build the ship as I was sailing it and learning this format. And I was a painter predominantly. That was kind of my most polished medium. And I had to unlearn that visual vocabulary, because the skill set that you're bringing in to paint is not what you want in a graphic novel, because there's not the right sense of flow. There's not the same use of negative space. And so I think really the hardest part for me was learning the reduction of visual language, and to move away from that idea that I was trying to accurately represent anything. And comics are basically they're shapes. You know, you have circles, squares, triangles. And for me, I think it was a process of settling into what is a definable face shape that's going to stick with these characters, and then using haircuts and, for me, glasses to basically give the viewer handholds to know who they're looking at.
Yeah. How did it, did you feel like a need to be really faithful to like your grandmother and your mother? I think drawing yourself is one thing. We can do whatever we want to ourselves. But like other people, is there like a sense of responsibility there?
To some extent, yeah. And it has been gratifying that I've had people who have later met my mother be like, oh, I already knew what your mom looked like. She looks so much like herself.
Does she? Does she look like that?
Yeah, she does.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, other people seem to think so mission accomplished. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone here who's met my mom. Yeah. So with my mom and my grandma, I think I was really clear on the fact that I was turning them into characters. And one of like the meta subtexts of the book is that nothing is true. And in that sense, I think it helps with not feeling as burdened by fidelity when you're trying to continually impart to the reader that everything is a question of craft. So no, I don't think I got too tied up with that. But I will say my Achilles heel, I cannot draw cars to save my life. They're weird shapes, and the tires do strange things in the wells. So if I had it to do over again, I would redraw every car in that book.
Or would you just get rid of all the cars?
Yeah, I'll just ponies.
Yeah, just do horses.
Like
you did
revisionist
horses
history.
beautifully.
Well, so actually that was part of, because obviously making this it meant that I had to live within my family's trauma loop for many, many years. And for better or for worse, I think, like, you know how some actors are method actors and they will like lose 60 pounds and do just appalling things to themselves to be able to put themselves in the position of who they're embodying. I work like that. And so this was hard. And so anywhere that I could interject some joy, I would. And part of that was like, well, if I've made myself a cowboy needs to have a horse. And that means anytime I want to, I can just throw in a morale pony and go for a ride.
The horses were great.
Thank you. I like drawing horses.
Yeah, I liked the horses. And also, like, every time you would draw yourself as a cowboy, it was really cute. Like, just super cute and joyful, I thought.
Yeah, thanks. No, I really, I mean, that's part of what I like to do as a maker is to have absurd and very overdeveloped metaphors where, like, the first time you encounter it, you're like, how can this possibly have anything to do with this book about intergenerational trauma and Chinese history? And actually, I wrote a 10,000 word outline before doing any of the images.
That's a really long outline. I just want you to know that.
It is, I know. Well, and so both my editor and my agent, they were like, yeah, I don't know about this cowboy thing. Maybe you should pull it. And I was like, just you wait. Because that's what I love, is you can take something that's an absurd conceit, and then 400 pages later, you can show that you've been breadcrumbing so that very absurdity is what's eventually going to make it so emotionally poignant. And I think probably the best example in popular culture of that was Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is like the most creative kinship I have ever felt to anything.
Super weird, super chaotic,
it's like
but
the
perfect.
Rocks and the googly eyes. You're like, I never would have thought that rocks sitting on a cliff were going to make me cry right now.
You know, when you were just saying that, like you were working kind of like a method actor would work. It occurred to me when I was reading it, like there's this like hamster wheel of your grandmother writing and rewriting and rewriting, and then I think so much of like making a graphic memoir is also redrawing and re-lettering and re-inking. And did you ever feel like you were living like that in a way?
Every single day for years during the darkest part of COVID, while living in a small town where I didn't have community. It was awesome.
What have I got myself into?
Yeah, but the way out was through. And I've talked a lot about how, for me, this book, it's like a Lord of the Rings situation where Frodo very much did not want to end up tasks with death marching the ring across Mordor and throwing it in Mount Doom. But there wasn't really a point where he could be like, ooh, just kidding. Maybe I'll just go back to the Shire. So I felt like I had to.
I know that feeling. I actually liken it to like when you're in labor and delivery with a baby, there's no way out but through. You can't, because at one point during my labor, I just yelled, I want to go home. And my nurse said, we can't do that. I was like, why? Why can't I just go home and have a sandwich? One of the really, in keeping with the visuals, so a lot of this story is actually quite epic, like the migration story of your mother and grandmother is actually very epic. Sort of the story of your adventures across, the world is also very epic. And there's a very also intimate story about relationships and emotions and trauma. And I felt like it was an interesting thing that I thought that the artwork really played to both of those things really well. Like when we were being really interior, the artwork helped open that up and give the space to, I think so often when we're writing sort of like family stories, we think of them as being small, but they're actually not. The feelings are very big, the traumas are very big. And I think your artwork really expanded that. And I think with the migration stuff, you're very good at drawing water, I have to say, and ocean. And all of that, I think, sort of was really a beautiful synthesis of the big story and the small story, not to give them values, but, did you ever really think about how you were going to draw, like, actually emotions and, like, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that quality that you're speaking to with the shift between the microcosm and the macrocosm, that is precisely why I did this as a graphic novel and why I did this kind of masochistic thing of like learning a new medium in my 30s and basically have the audacity to sort of like Babe Ruth point and be like, I'm going there, even though I have no idea what I'm doing at the outset. But there's something that a poet friend of mine, Hannah Stevenson, she said that being a poet was simultaneously looking at Where's Waldo and Magic Eye, those little like hidden three-dimensional, you kind of cross your eyes. And that always stayed with me. And so I think in everything that I'm making, I'm always thinking about like how do you simultaneously hone in on the details while also keeping this roaming loose focus that allows the hidden thing to show up in what is like a very neutral background.
I find really interesting as you're talking, you're very, very honest in this book about how you struggled to make it, how you struggled to write it, how you struggled to research it. Pretty much every step of the way, you're very open about that. And that's not something that authors always do. I think that we sometimes make it seem like a magical mystery ride to people, but it's actually not. So what made you make the decision to be so like honest with your readers about how hard it was?
I'm a bad liar. I think that is part of it, but also, one of the main themes in the book is the way in which the control of narrative, whether it be from the communist government, whether it be from my grandmother needing to assert a version of reality through her memoir, or my mother needing to control everything about the interior of my mind, I think all of those factors contributed to making me a very, very clear, direct communicator who is incapable of guile. And I think that I find a lot of solace in transparency. And it's a quality that I think has really served me well in my work, because that's kind of what I do, is I'm really interested in revealing process. Like I'm way more interested in process than product.
Mm-hmm. I'm also very interested in process. I'm always really fascinated. Like one of the questions I ask writers, I'll ask you this right now, is like, what is the one office supply tool you can never live without?
I have 2 dinosaur-shaped paintbrush holders that appear frequently in the book.
Yeah,
Their names are Norbert and Winnie, and they literally sit on my desk. But that's also the way that I'm signaling to my reader, like, we're in the present now, and I'm narrating from the studio. So they are kind of also morale objects in the book,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
actually kept a check mark on a piece of paper where I was playing a game for myself that the number of times I drew my paintbrush dinosaurs had to be at least equal to and ideally greater than the number of times I drew my crying mother. So I had a dinosaurs versus crying mother
There are a lot of dinosaurs.
and a lot of crying mothers.
A lot of crying mother. Yeah,
I haven't actually gone through and counted, but I think I succeeded.
The one thing on my desk is it's a Lego minifigure, and she's called the librarian, but she looks just like me.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and she's holding a mug that says shh.
Yeah, I did a project. So what I really love to do is collaborate, and I'm somebody where I'm think like being an artist, I like to spark off of things. And so for me, just being like, let me mine the interior is my personal hell. And so Seattle used to have a literary festival, and I got to ask that very question of about 30 writers of like, what is the weird talisman that sits on your desk? And then I drew all of them.
That's very cute.
Well, and the best
I
part
love that.
is they were all like 3x3 and ink wash, so they were pretty quick for me to do. And
Yeah.
some people asked about, can I buy these? And I was like, I have a better idea because I'm curious about all of you now. So tell you what, anyone who wants yours, just take me for a meal. That can be like a taco from a taco truck. It can be as fancy as you want, but like let's hang out, have a meal together, and just get to know each other. Because now I'm intrigued by all of you because I've like drawn the weird things you keep in your desk, like your vial of teeth.
That someone had a vial of teeth?
Yeah, Jean
what
Capo
kind?
Crusay. She had a vial of human teeth.
Okay, I was going to ask you if they were human. Where'd she get them?
I don't remember. It's been a minute.
There's only a couple of ways you could like accumulate a vial of teeth. That's not scary.
Yeah, well, another friend of mine, Richard Chiem, who wrote King of Joy, he has this hippo statue, and he wrote this book about like Pablo Escobar's attack hippos going kind of feral on like a pornography campground.
Did that actually happen?
The hippos, that's real. But like
Yeah.
to this day, I now associate him with hippos. So I have a friend, every time I see a hippo, it's like how we have little catch-ups. I'm just like, I have encountered a hippo. How are you?
Okay, this is great.
You said in the green room, you're like, what kind of questions? I was like, I'd like tangents.
As do I. It's really interesting. Like, it's such a huge part of this book is like about mental illness, mental health, and all of that stuff. This is not a secret to anyone who's read my book. I've been in counseling more or less most of my life since I've been about 8 years old, which I think might make my family and your family very unique among Asian families. That mental health was an actual point of discussion, and it was something that people talked about. And so I guess there was a question out of that. Oh, how hard was it for you to write? Because there's quite a lot of like psychology in Feeding Ghosts. So how hard was it for you to write that stuff, or was it a language that you were already kind of conversant with because mental illness was a topic of discussion?
Well, it was really a tricky one because basically my mom's fear. So my mom was about 10 years old when her mother had a mental breakdown that she never recovered from. And so basically when I turned 10, it was like a flip switched in my mom. And she was so determined that I not follow the same path as her mother that she started preemptively sending me to a barrage of endless, like any mental health practitioner you could find, basically saying, there's something wrong with her, we have to find it before it happens. And so it's interesting talking to sort of like Americans in the TikTok era of psychology who are like very quick to go to really judgmental clinical language. And this is something that I often push back against, is there's a lot of people who like take what my mom did and put it in the vocabulary of abuse. And I think for me, I understand where she was coming from and why she did what she did, but I don't deny the fact that basically like the modalities of therapy were like used as a form of psychological torture against me for a good chunk of my childhood. And so those were some of the hardest parts of the book for me to write because I have like a deep somatic like around it. And that was a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I was like, because it's very detailed. It's actually quite, as someone who's conversant in the language of psychology, it made all the sense in the world to me. What do you think about this sort of like TikTok pop psychology? Because like everybody has an opinion about like, whether you follow Therapy Jeff on Instagram or whether, like, how do you feel about like the way people are like using pop psychology so freely?
I think it's really dangerous, and I think it's one of the forces that is causing us as a society and culture to lose our ability to hold empathy and grace for other human beings.
Yeah.
And I think it's creating essentially the weaponization of the language of mental health, where it is a way for people to dodge personal accountability by adopting a pathologized language that essentially justifies what they want to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Jonah Hill. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I won't bring it up. It doesn't matter. But yeah, I feel the same. And like whenever anybody says you should read Brene Brown, I said, how about I just don't? Like I could just read a book by Tessa Hulls instead. I don't want to read that. So you write this book with there's a lot of honesty here, especially about the way you grew up, about the stories, the way that your mother was and your grandmother were while you were growing up. And I realize that when you're writing the past, one of the things is that it's hard to find actual truth. There is no real truth. But the honesty with which you write, is that something that you intended to do from the outset, that was something you wanted to do, or did you feel yourself getting pushed into more and more honesty against your will? There are two types of memoir writers, right? The ones who really, really want to be honest and are like 100% on board, and the other type who has to be pushed into it and hate it.
Well, I think I always meant to be honest, but I originally meant to write a completely different book, which was going to be a history book. And I was not going to be a character. There were going to be no feelings. And I would not touch any of the squishy, uncomfortable things. And so I think in that way, we sort of have to Dumbo's feather, like lie to ourselves to get us to the point we need to. And maybe some part of me always knew that I was going to have to talk about feelings. But I managed to lie to myself for a number of years before having that realization. And I think for me, part of it was when, so my grandmother's memoir hadn't been translated into English until I got a grant and had it translated for this project. And because my mom didn't teach me Chinese and my grandma didn't speak English and was also very heavily medicated, she and I had never really been able to have a conversation. And so when I opened my grandmother's memoir and heard her voice for the first time through that, it really obliterated the idea of her being a wholly sympathetic character. And I had that like Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff. He has that moment of heartbreaking self-awareness before gravity happens. And I think that was that for me, where I was like, oh no, this has just now complicated everything. And I'm going to have to make this book be about the meta act of what is truth and narrative, and how do you choose an ethical line through a story when nothing can be believed.
That actually, when you were writing about her memoir, is some of the most fascinating parts of the book. The way she wrote about her life, the way she was probably mythologizing herself, the self-aggrandizing. Like, it was fascinating. Did your mother ever read that book?
She did. Well, so that's what's so interesting about it, is she had the copy of it, the copy that I had translated in Chinese. My mom had it, and this is where, I talk about my mom. She has a ghost twin with this like flat affect, and these days she says that, oh, I've forgotten all my Chinese characters, I can't read it. But she had that book and could have read it at any point, and instead held onto it for decades until she supposedly lost the language enough she couldn't read it. And that to me is fascinating, that rather than saying, oh, there's something in here that I can't touch because it's too painful, I'm going to pretend that I'm indifferent.
It was the way she survived, maybe. Yeah, we were saying in the green room, like, do I have a crazy Asian mother, or is she a traumatized, immigrant? It's hard to know where it comes from. It doesn't matter, actually. The origins of it don't matter. One of the things actually about your mother in this book is you take a research trip together to China and Hong Kong, and I remember reading it, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I would never do that with my mother. So good for you, but like, what did your mother's presence on that trip, how did that add sort of like texture and layers to what you were doing?
I mean, it was really the only time I gained access to the person I was trying to understand. And there's a scene in the book where mostly my mom was looking at Hong Kong and China and seeing all the ways in which it didn't line up with her memories. Because my mom is basically a walking time capsule. And it's really interesting because, you know, my family dialect was Shanghainese. And my mom was saying when we were over there that anyone she spoke to who was under the age of 40, they were like, whoa, you talk funny. Because basically her language stopped evolving because the only person she spoke to was her mother. And so she speaks like a really kind of formal, strange version of the dialect. And I remember her being really, not moved, but sort of her realization. I remember she told me, she said, these children understand me, but their children won't. And it was like this moment of her realizing that the China that she was continuing to live in didn't exist. And then that moment of self-awareness is like, oh, nope, let's not look at it, on to the next thing. But I had to bring her to a history museum to sort of unlock the family stories because she needed to see like a wax replicas of like Disneyland China to talk about the things that I was trying to get her to share. So that was really fascinating.
Yeah. Did she have a good time, do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it meant a lot to her that I really just wanted to understand her story and that we spent that much time together. I think both of us see it as really a gift. I'm really, really glad that I did it.
Good. Has she read your book?
It's sad and tricky to answer that because she has dementia and she had a mini stroke basically as the publicity and launch was ramping up on this. And so I'd shown her a lot of the book and we worked closely, but I never just left her with it because like one of the main themes, if you read it, is that my mom has an extraordinary capacity for projection. And so I was very careful to be like, I'm not gonna show her anything that can't be like entirely self-contained because she'll like see a glimpse of something through a moving train and then build a world out of it. And so unfortunately now cognitively she's not in a state where she can read at all, but one of her friends is doing an incredibly loyal, kind thing, and they have a phone meeting once a week, and my mom's friend is helping my mom read aloud.
That's so lovely.
And explain it to her.
Yeah.
So that is an ongoing and slow process happening now.
That's so lovely. I find that really, people ask me all the time, my mom has read my books. My mom doesn't read English, which is a great blessing for me. And no one has offered to translate it for her. Nobody.
That's good.
Don't do it, because I write about her all the time. So how has this process been, promoting a book that is so personal to you all over the place and having this be out in the world, which is a story of like your family and it's pretty intimate?
I mean, I think the fact that I never wanted to make it is really liberating because, you know, a lot of my writer friends, they're like really want to micromanage the process and they have all these things they want and they're like, why am I not getting the XYZ? Whereas for me, I'm like, the only thing I wanted was my life back. Yeah. And so the instant it came out, like mission accomplished. I was done.
It's a thing.
It is.
Yeah.
It is not inside of me. It is out there. and I can use it in a dark alleyway.
You could. Yeah. You could use it as a doorstop. It's ideal for home defense.
Yeah, I mean, I did kind of, well, so actually, when I got my author copies, I would say I have like I've not done what I'm supposed to by the conceits of literary world. I did not do a cute unboxing video. I have not posed it with cute animals telling people to, you know, leave reviews on Goodreads. But what I did do, because you get an author box, right? And you're supposed to like use those copies in like calculating ways that will help further the book's life. And instead I was like, okay, I know what I'm gonna do with these. And I contacted some of my friends who work in Antarctica and we're still down there, and some friends of mine who work on a glacier in Alaska. And I played the game of like, what are the most remote environments with no people that I can get these copies to? And I actually just hiked one up to a remote fire lookout through deep snow about 48 hours ago and left it up there.
Oh, did you take pictures? Obviously.
That one I grudgingly did. Yeah, so that's what I'm sitting on, is I have lots of pictures of this book, like at the bottom of the world, like in icy places. Yeah, so I gave them to like my feral adventure buddies, and that's kind of been like a quiet joy project that I've told no one about.
That's a really nice way for your book to have a life out in the world, actually.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the thing, is for me, I don't know, the thing about my family's story that I think was so heartbreaking is effectively the traumas that happened to my mother and my grandmother severed them from the fabric of other human lives. Their lives stopped, and they lived in this incredibly heartbreaking isolation that was so complete that they couldn't even see the borders of it. And I needed to make this book in order to restore the headwaters and let everything begin to flow again. And so for me, the idea of trying to hype this book as a product and do the things that I'm supposed to be doing, I'm like, I don't care. I genuinely don't care. I just want all of us to be able to be alive again.
That's the best way to be, to actually not care. On that note, I hope you guys care, because we're going to have some questions from the audience. Oh my gosh. Putting your book in remote locations is better than reading your Goodreads reviews. Yes, you have a question.
They have. The ghosts have been fed, and it is so delightful to really be able to, like, I did the thing my mom always wanted, and I was a good Chinese daughter, and I put everything I wanted on hold to serve the family's needs. And I did that, and now I don't have to anymore.
That sounds great. Yeah, I should try that.
What do your ghosts want you to do?
I already wrote the book. I think it's fine now.
But, I mean, do you feel like yours are appeased?
Actually, yes, because I actually wrote about this once in a poem. My grandmother came to visit me when I was writing the book. She was dead, had been dead for 25 years. And she said, the way that you wrote me in the book is not right. It was a novel, but it was a fictionalized version of my family. No one understands me. This is what you need to write. And then I did it. I changed it the way she wanted me to, and she's never come back. So I feel like they must be appeased.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how you know you've done your job, is that the weight of need and expectation, it dissipates.
Yeah, I guess. Like, I used to be haunted all the time. I used to see my dead relatives all the time. It's a long story. We don't have time for it. Does anyone have another question? Yes, go ahead. Oh, yeah, the question's about, I'm going to try to repeat it for the recording. What mediums you're working in that you like to experiment with, genres that you choose.
Yeah, so I, in retrospect, very hubristically thought that because I was a writer and a painter, I more or less had the skill set to be a graphic novelist. And I think for me, it was learning how to use negative space was probably what took the longest. And my gateway drug to comics was actually poetry. A lot of my besties are all poets, and thinking about the structural mechanics of language and the way in which both those mediums are about guiding the way in which a viewer navigates the page. So I would say poetry was really the bedrock of how I taught myself. And then I live in Seattle, and there's a great library system there. I'm like a library super fan, so I love that this is at this space. So I would just go and check out like a linear foot of graphic novels about once a week, and then just pour through them. And I was deliberately not trying to choose just the best ones, because I think you learn more by seeing things that don't succeed. And I would just like trash compactor all of that until I had a really clear sense of kind of the half dozen that were the biggest touchstones, and that I knew what I was trying to take from each element. And I think also being really multidisciplinary, if I'm trying to figure out how to work in a certain medium, I'm not studying that form to learn it. And actually my friend Kyle Loven, it was so fun because he's also an artist, and we met in Seattle during this thing that used to happen called Genre Bender, where two artists who work in wildly different mediums are placed together by like a matchmaker, and you have a couple months to make a weird art baby together. And Kyle is an experimental puppeteer who's like obsessed with intricate dioramas, and I learned so much from that collaboration. And I still think about some of the things from that. So I think my tendency is to be like, okay, I would need to learn how to be a comics artist. I'm gonna go see some weird contemporary performance art. Or like, oh, I need to figure out this painting. I need to go see dance. So yeah, I try and switch it up.
That was a great question. Any others? Yes, over there. Was the question like how far into the history you had to get before the ghosts emerged? Did I get that right?
or like when did when did my attempt to lie to myself about what I was making actually become apparent? Well, so the history book I thought I was going to make is in there. I think it's just interspersed with these other braids that I wasn't expecting to have to tackle. And I think the process of learning that history was what made me realize I couldn't write a history book, because so much of the history that I'm talking about with the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, it's about the deliberate destruction of archives and facts and how the government was really imposing a top-down narrative. And so to tell that as an act of clean history, I think would be to lose the most honest part of it. And there's a line that I quote in the book by Karen Russell, who wrote the amazingly weird novel Swaplandia. And she says, to be a true historian, one has to mourn amply and well. And so I think when that process of mourning began is when I realized that the only way to tell this story and tell this history honestly was by acknowledging this really unexpected journey it was forcing me to go on.
The history of communist China, actually, Mao's China in this book is really, really well done, I have to say. And there is no extricating the family story from that story, because communist China defined what became of your grandmother and your mother so much, right?
Yeah, and I also think that that's been one of the most gratifying parts of having the book out in the world, is lots of people have reached out to me and basically said, whoa, my family, same history. And that's because there are mass exoduses happening around all these same central events, and people thought they were leaving for a matter of weeks or months for things to kind of settle down. And so people were going into exile unaware that it was going to be 30 years. Yeah. And I think that was one of the most powerful things in doing this research, was understanding just the sheer number of people who were displaced by the exact same history.
Yeah, the Chinese diaspora has a lot of that same kind of history, even though they're literally everywhere all over the world now.
Yeah, and I think it explains why all of us have such similarly complicated relationships to our mothers.
Yeah. We could talk about that too.
Or not.
Yeah. You have a question.
There's a moment in the book where you are speaking to the California city that you grew up in, and you say your mom asked you not to mention the city, and it was this a really fascinating moment for me reading it, and I'm just curious how you navigated. This book is your story, it's your family story as well, and how did you sort of navigate when sometimes those were in conflict of like maybe something that you wanted to share, but then considering what they maybe felt comfortable or not comfortable with?
Yeah, so the question is about how you navigate between writing your own story and still feeling or still, demonstrating care for the stories of others, like your mother and your grandmother, who you're obviously writing about too.
I mean, again, I think transparency for me was the way through. And by kind of doing that nod to the reader of, I grew up in a small town in Northern California, my mom has asked me to not name it, it's bringing an awareness to the reader that this is a crafted narrative, and that there has been conversation with other people about what is and is not included. And there's one page, probably about 3/4 of the way through the book, where my mom sort of channeled her trauma into an endless array of faith hopping. So I have like a very well-rounded lack of belief in religions and a lot of other woo-woo things. And my mom ended up getting a degree in psychospirituality from an unaccredited Northern California institution that like maybe went up in flames in a lawsuit at some point. Anyways, but my mom like really credits it as being like this deep transformative experience in her life, whereas I think she joined a cult. And so there's a page in there where that was the one thing my mom said I could not touch. She calls it the Institute. So I'm like, if you don't want people to think it's a cult, maybe like reconsider your branding here. But I handled that by showing my mom and me holding a scroll together, and I say, I'm apprehensive about this because this is the one thing my mom said I couldn't touch in this book. And so the scroll is saying the agreed upon facts, and then my mom and I are both in text bubbles. narrating our sort of emotional interpretations of those. And I say in the book, there's kind of like a same ... I was like, well, my mom says I can't call it a cult in the book. And it's funny because, of course, like all of the press, that's the one page they all talk about. And I was like,
Really?
I was really hoping my mom wouldn't know that I had done this.
Is that the page the media caught on to?
They have glommed onto that one because I think it is really, it does kind of distill the crystal of so many of those ethical considerations and like my conversations with my mother. But getting back to your point of how did I navigate that, I think with every pass through and every edit of the book, the question that I was asking myself was, is there anywhere that I can interject more compassion? Where are there spaces where I can put more grace? And I have a lot of difficulty when I read memoirs or really any creative work where people are being thrown under the bus, because I think that is an easy and not very interesting choice, and that's not what I wanted to make. And so even though I think there are areas of the book where I am saying critical and painful things, I always try and do so with empathy.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to. Yeah.
How much did the writing influence the images and images influence the writing? Did you find like a cyclical process happening?
Yeah. How much did your writing influence the images, and how much did the images influence the writing?
Oh, Elvis, the can of worms you have just opened. So I drew and wrote the entire book simultaneously, and there was never a script or thumbnails or pencils, and sometimes I was doing the final direct inking on parts of a page without knowing what the rest of the page would look like or what the text would be. And the only reason I was able to do this is because my editor had never done a graphic novel. And so she didn't understand how it was supposed to work. And when I had conversations with interested editors, and I was lucky that there was a lot of interest. And so I did talk to a couple of traditional graphic novel publishers, and I was like, that's not gonna work. They're gonna try and corral me into something much more mainstream, and that's why I went with the editor that I did. Is she was the one who's like, oh, I see that freak flag you're flying, and like I want you to raise it as high as possible. And so I had a really funny conversation with her at one point where she said that once she bought the book, she went to a friend of hers who was a graphic novelist, and she was like, okay, so what happens? And he said, oh, well, first you're gonna get the script, then you're gonna get the thumbnails, and then blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, I don't think she's doing any of that. So I don't know. I think the way that I work as a painter and in kind of every discipline is I get a phrase of text lodged in my head, and then I have to make a body of work to understand what it means. And usually that takes like 3 months and 12 to 16 paintings, as opposed to 9 years and 400 black and white paintings, which is how I think about this. But for smaller projects, what I would do is I would work on all of the paintings simultaneously, and so they would all be on one wall, and I would take them down and, you know, maybe like paint 6 of them in the course of a day so that they all cross the finish line as one cohesive body of work. And that is exactly how I made this book, but logistically, I calculated it. There's 4,000 square feet of drawings, and it's all hand-drawn in Japanese brush pen. And so I used a program called Scrivener that a lot of nonfiction writers use because it gave me the ability to digitally build out a wall large enough to hold the entire book. And yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but I think that is why this ended up not a typical graphic novel, as I did not make it as one. A book-length doodle? Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a obsessively organized mind map, and I think again going back to earlier I was talking about a poet friend of mine said that poetry is like simultaneously playing Where's Waldo and Magic Eye, and I think in my mind that book it's like a 4,000 square foot Where's Waldo Magic Eye. Yeah, and it would be interesting because there is some interest in me showing the originals in a museum show, which thankfully I've worked in small enough spaces that I've never actually been able to see them all up side by side, but it would be really interesting to see how they would sort of be in conversation that way if they were just taken as one very, very, very large drawing. I mean, I'm happy to never look at it again.
On that note, also my kid is really impressed with it. He's a visual artist, so I want you to know that. He's 14 and impressed by nothing, so that is a big deal.
Oh, wait, can I tell you the most charming tangent?
Yeah.
So I've been staying with friends everywhere on book tour, and I was in LA staying with some friends of mine, and I overheard their 9-year-old son saying, "How did you convince a graphic novelist to stay with us?"
That's
I know,
delightful.
right?
That's delightful.
It's like they fed me. It's very easy.
I like that. Keep that forever in here for whenever you're feeling down. That's what you have to remember. I want to thank Tessa Hulls for joining us here tonight. What a wonderful time. Massey Books is here. If you would like to buy a book, please buy Feeding Ghosts. And I want to thank Jorge and Vancouver Public Library and Uplift Asian for doing this wonderful programming. And everybody have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.